Thank you. It's a challenge to me to come and talk to you here. A double challenge because I come from a very different system, and one in which we never had to think about some of the questions that exercise you. And the relationship between the humanities, history, and medicine in the UK has been vastly different from what it is here, and indeed what it is in most of the world. Namely, that from the 1970s onwards, history of medicine as a subject to be taught to students at university has taken place largely outside the medical school. It is only in the last 15 years that every medical school has had to have a properly qualified professor or teacher of the history of medicine. Until then, many of the smaller medical schools had something in which an elderly professor, and it was usually an elderly male professor, would speak for 1, 2, or 3 lectures on the history of medicine. The first lecture would be a history of medicine from Noah to the present day, and the second lecture would be a history of my medical school, and that was all. But in the 1960s, the Wellcome Trust decided that it should do something about the professionalization of teaching in the history of medicine. And it did this in 2 ways. One of which, in fact, still continues today, which is that there is an old, ancient London guild called the Society of Apothecaries, Pharmacists, you might say, founded in 1667, I think. And they have an interest in medical school education. And they give money for people to teach in medical schools. And from the 1960s, they organized a course in the history of medicine once every 2 weeks on a Saturday morning for medical people to come to London and study the history of medicine with people who were, let's say, professional or semi-professional. So that was one, that was teaching the history of medicine, if you like, to medical people. Many of these are retired doctors, some of them are medical students, and this continues to this day. And just before I came, I lectured on a special revision course on the history of medicine, at which there were 40 medics. The second was that the Wellcome decided to set up academic research units in various parts of the UK to teach the history of medicine at a professional level, at a research level. The first one was set up in Cambridge. Why Cambridge? Because there had been for 20 years a successful program in what was called natural and medical sciences for the history of science. And you could take a year's set of courses in history of medicine, history of science, and Cambridge was an obvious place to begin. And I actually remember being, I won't say interviewed, but being invited to take part in planning by Joseph Needham, who was the great historian of Chinese science. And Cambridge was the first place where a group was set up specifically to teach the history of medicine. And it was also in Cambridge because Cambridge University at that point did not have a medical school. If you went to Cambridge as a doctor, you spent 3 years as a medical undergraduate, and then you moved to London or somewhere else for your clinical work. So Cambridge provided an ideal environment for teaching undergraduates who weren't involved in actual clinical work. Second unit was Oxford. The third unit was London, where there had already been a course of lectures, 1624 lectures, given in history of science at UCL, but not for medical students. It was in history of science. The fourth one was Edinburgh, but that only lasted 2 years because the way in which it was funded, the funds went to the head of department, and he unfortunately died. So that was the end of the money. And then the fifth one was Manchester. The Scottish one was reinstated in Glasgow. So we had 5 units: Oxford, Cambridge, London, Manchester, Scotland. Set up to teach primarily medical students, but embedded in their own little unit within another department. In Cambridge, it was in history of science. In Oxford, it was in history. In Manchester, it was history of science. In Glasgow, it was medicine. And in London, it was the Department of Anatomy. In London, we were more embedded in medical teaching to undergraduates. Undergraduates studied, in those days, you studied medicine for 2 years, basic medicine, and you could, in certain places, take a year to specialize in something. You could take a year out at government expense, and you could study what you wanted. If you wanted to study theology, you could do it. If you wanted to study engineering for a year, you could. If you wanted to study advanced physiology, you could. And this was the slot where we could teach history of medicine. We have 2 sorts of students. We have students throughout their years who came for one set of lectures. My lectures. Roy Porter's lectures on patients and doctors. Bill Bynum's lectures on Darwin, lectures on psychiatry. People could come for one course. Or a certain number of students could choose to come for a whole year. And they came to us not just from London, but from Edinburgh, from Dublin, from Newcastle, from Sheffield, from different medical schools where history of medicine was not taught for substantial parts of the time. So we had a year's medical students, and we had to teach them the history of medicine. Who were we? We were, with almost, well, without exception, ignorant. We did not know history of medicine. Bill Bynum had in fact studied history of medicine for a year at Yale, and he then did a PhD in Cambridge on history of medicine, and he studied for 6 months in Zurich with the historian Erwin Achterknecht. So he was medically qualified and had studied some medical history. His assistant had studied, Michael Neve, had studied history in Cambridge. Third person, Chris Lawrence, had been a doctor, had practiced as a doctor in one of the Scottish islands, a remote part of the United Kingdom. And he'd then taken a diploma in the history of medicine, and he'd then begun a PhD. And he was appointed just before he got his PhD. So he was medically qualified, and I was the fourth, and I am totally unqualified to teach anything. I was a professional classicist, a philologist. I taught ancient history in Cambridge, but for the previous 6 or 7 years, I had become involved in the history of ancient medicine, and principally Galen, and my interests shifted. And the 4 of us were given an unusual opportunity. Go and teach medical students for 5 years. If you do well, you will be made to have another 5 years of teaching. If you do not, that is the end of history of medicine. My professor said, "You are the experts. You teach what you wish to teach. But remember, you're teaching medical students. Remember, what you have to teach has got to be something that will help them in their future careers." And that was all. 20 years later, we had, the bureaucracy had all changed. The bureaucrats don't like individuals. And we had to fill in our forms. And they had to go and find out what we had said we were going to teach 20 years before. My plan was extensive. 38 lines, that's all. Bill Bynum's was short, 5 lines. It said, I shall teach the history of medicine from the 17th century to the 20th century. I shall also teach the history of biology, focusing on Charles Darwin. I shall help to organize a seminar on the history of medicine. That was it. Two people unqualified in medicine, two people with medical qualifications. What are you trying to teach medical students if you know no medicine? It's a challenge, but it's also an easy challenge, because medicine is a human science. You cannot be a good doctor if you simply look at your computer or your screen or your ultrasound machine. Medicine is a subject that deals with humans. And historians are supposed to write human history. And that gives you as historians a chance. Because we found that there were areas that we could talk about from our own reading, our own work in the sources, in the archives, reading books, that we could use to engage the students. Every one of you has got some expertise in something. I hope. Every one of you has got something that you're doing as historians, economists, philosophers, that relates to human beings. And medical students, we found, responded to questions about medicine as a humane subject. Because our medical teaching, and I do not say anything about Russian medical teaching, was simply a question of, we write it on the blackboard, you look at it, you copy it down, you learn it, and then we move on to the next lecture. And it was very interesting how in my 30 years plus of teaching, many of our best medical students came to us because they were dissatisfied with the teaching of medicine they'd received and wanted to explore the wider questions of what it means to be a doctor. I think we were successful. Our numbers, the highest number of students for this one-year course we ever had was over 40, but we had to cut the numbers back. A, because it was really, the numbers were just that little bit too big, and because other groups who also wanted students to do that year with them complained that we were getting all of the best students. So we had to sort of say, look, we're putting a limit. But we used to have about 30 full-time students and perhaps 300, 400 students a year taking one course or another. We were fortunate that soon after we began, we had the phenomenon that was Roy Porter, who joined. And Roy Porter wrote more books in a year than most people write articles. If you look at the Library of Congress bibliography catalogue, you will see that there are 4 Roy Porters. But Roy was the great publicist. Roy had not studied medicine. He'd studied the history of geology for his thesis. But he was interested in humankind. And so with him, everybody was inspired to become pioneers and missionaries. What's the role of a historian in the history of medicine? What's the world can you contribute to a course among medical students? And the answer is very simple. You can if you try and if you are very lucky. I will say that. We did not regard ourselves as successors until the point when we had a history PhD appointed to teach in a medical school, and that took about 8 or 9 years. We didn't think of us as successors until we had an MD appointed to teach the history of medicine in a history department. And that took 12 years. But the triumph of getting somebody to teach, a historian to teach in a medical school, took time, but it could be done in different ways. Most of our graduates, PhDs, if they were medical, found posts in medical schools. If they were historians, they tended to find posts in history departments. But very often, in the history department, they were allowed to go to the medical school and teach 4 hours a year, but to teach something, or to put on seminar in the medical school on some history of medicine topic. So even if you people are going to move to a history department, you may have the opportunity of, I won't say walking across the road, but there's quite a lot of road in Moscow, but you're likely to have the opportunity to make contacts and say, why don't we put on, as part of your work, a seminar? Now, there's a very simple reason that was told me by one of my German colleagues, when I was asked why he never collaborated with the history department, which was literally across the street. He said, they don't pay me. Well, that seems to me to be a rather Philistine view. And I said to him, but why don't you say to the historians, I'm just moving my seminar across the road. You can continue to pay me. Oh, he said, I never thought of that one. Funnily, we found that medical students became interested in what we had to say, because we were trying to teach them, and this was the overall, what I call the overall message that we were trying to teach them, was that as doctors you are going to deal with patients. Patients are a nuisance. Patients don't do what doctors demand. Patients come to see a doctor when it's too late. Some patients come to see a doctor when they shouldn't. The doctor has to learn to deal with patients. The doctor has to learn, and I see at least one person who smiles at that effect, you have got to learn to deal with the bureaucracy, the Ministry of Health, the local health bodies. You have got to learn to deal with the structures which are around you. You as historians, people who've studied economics, are in a better position than many people to explain these structures. Why? I don't know the structures in Russia. I know them in Germany. I know them in Britain. But you are people who are trained to look at historical structures. And they affect you in ways that perhaps people don't imagine. Many years ago, before I retired, I wanted to set up an international project, and indeed I nearly got there, on medical identities in the Eastern Mediterranean countries. Looking at medicine in Egypt, in Israel, in Turkey, and in Greece. 4 neighboring countries, all of whom think they practice the same medicine, all of whom think they know what medicine is about, all of whom have profoundly different medical systems that go back, in some cases 150 years, to, in the case of Egypt, a combination of France and Britain. Israel is 1930s America. Turkey is 1870s Germany. And Greece is a wonderful mixture of Britain, America, and French and German. And what is it like to set up, this would make a wonderful international project, just looking at the effects of history on the way in which people are living today. We got people who were prepared. Unfortunately, it took so long. I was about to retire and I couldn't apply for the funding, but I'm hoping that at some point we are going to be able, somebody is going to be able to take it up and find the international funding. Because it seems to me that this would be valuable, working on one hand with people who know the medical side of it, and people who know the historical side, as a way of trying to, if you like, help the medical systems in those countries to benefit from what is the best in each other's system. In a sense, that's what historians can do. So you, as historians, have got some advantages against doctors. You know about history. You know about research. You know about, I hope you know about archives. I hope you know about how to read a book. Doctors don't. You have got advantages. And even in a difficult situation, as it is today in Russia, it's possible that one can find, even if you begin your life as historians in a history department, you can find a way of introducing medical students to some of the things that you have found. But you also, when you work with doctors, have to learn that doctors have their own views. I began my research work far more years ago than I care to remember. But I went for a time to the London School of Economics to study sociology. And I was interested in sociology of professions. And I began writing a thesis on professions in classical antiquity. I now realise that that's much too big. I couldn't do it. So I concentrated on doctors, because doctors are the strangest group of people you will ever find. Doctors are deliberately made strange because we give them privileges. You can't go and plunge a knife into somebody in the street. You can't poke your finger into a young lady's backside. You can't tell a lady to take her clothes off and you can feel all over. Well, you can, but very. We have got deliberately to teach doctors how to behave as doctors. We give them enormous privileges. We give them enormous dangers. And half of the medical education is changing them from normal students to doctors. We think you forget that. But we've got to turn them from being that person who's down in the bar with you, drinking away and having a wonderful time, to somebody who's given enormous privileges in their professional life. Far more than we give lawyers, far more than we give priests, far more than we give economists. Doctors are strange people. And if you live and work with doctors, you have to learn to live with their priorities, their interests. Most historians, in my opinion, aren't interested in ethics. You'd have great difficulty, I think, filling a course on ethics in 17th century France. For doctors, ethics is an important feature of their world. Doctors are interested in things like epidemic disease. They're interested in things that the general public may or may not be interested in. And they're interested in the workings of the human body in a way that most people are not, let's face it. And if one works with doctors, you end up having to learn what it is to be a doctor, to learn alongside. A medical historian, many years ago, said to me, "You'll never be a proper medical historian." I said, "Why?" He said, "You're not medically trained." I said, "Well, I can read my books on anatomy." He said, No. He said, "You won't learn what it is to be a doctor until you're faced with the decision about what to do with the patient." I think I qualify. I've had 4 cases in my life where I have had to give advice on whether to send somebody to hospital, whether to treat them at home, indeed even to diagnose. On one occasion, my diagnosis was actually wonderfully perfect because I had seen the boy in question eating lots of chocolates and things, and when 2 hours later his school teacher came to me and said he's feeling very sick, his stomach is very, he thinks he's got appendicitis. I could at least test for appendicitis and say, I think he's overeaten. If in the morning, send him to bed. In the morning, if it's still bad, send for the doctor. And of course, in the morning it had gone away, and my reputation as Dr. Nаттон was very high in Moscow at that point. You have to learn to live with doctors. You have to learn from them, and most often they will help. Very few doctors, I think, will turn you away if you ask for specifically medical help. Very few doctors, in my experience, will. Many of them will find it a challenge that somebody who isn't a doctor raises problems with them that they can answer. Of course, you've got to find your doctor, but that's probably as easier than finding a historian. They have at least a plaque on the door. There is a place I've always found for history. There's been a place for history in contemporary medicine, epidemiology in particular. And so I'm relatively optimistic that one can, as a historian, contribute something to medical education. It is not going to be easy. There are structures, there are walls, there are institutions, there are bureaucrats. There is a simple question of money, but it may be done, and there may be ways in which one can find a place for you as historians. I was also asked to comment on how one can write medical history, how one can write what one does, how one writes the articles, where you publish them. And again, it's a difficult question. All of you, as doctoral students, should be able to write elegant, eloquent Russian. You should be able to write in a way that is accessible to people out in the street. And so I don't need to tell you how to write Russian. What I can say is that what matters is, first of all, having something to say. A medical history journal, I speak as an editor for 30 years, is not going to turn an article away because it deals with an unfamiliar subject. I regret turning down a paper on Stone Age bone surgery in Latvia, not because we didn't like Stone Age bone surgery in Latvia, but because actually it was very badly written. The English was good, but it really wasn't suitable as a good article. But one can publish things provided you have something to say and make sure that the audience knows what that is about. There are history of medicine journals that will take something in English. There are fewer, of course, that will take it in Russian, and you've simply got Russian medical journals, I think. But what we want as editors is something new, is something that reveals that you are passionate about what you're writing. If you found something that's good, that interests you, and can tell me what it is, you have a chance of being published. If all you do is produce something, well, these are the archives and so on, and this is what I have found, in that dull way, you're not going to be published. What you have to do is focus on telling me as the ignorant reader what it is you discovered, why you think it's important, what you think it's going to make, why you think it's going to make a difference to me. That's the only advice I can give. You can try a variety of journals. It may be that there are some journals that are, shall we say, less prestigious or have a shorter publishing time. If you're a research student and looking for a job, you need to find something in a journal that will publish within 18 months. You can't afford to have a journal that will take 5 years to publish. You need a job. But the whole point is, it's got to be something that engages someone who doesn't know what you know. Russian medicine, and one of the points I've been trying to make to my colleagues along the road, you have an advantage because we in the West don't know very much about Russian medicine. You fail to realize how much new material you've got. You know it. Your teachers know it. I don't. And I've probably read more medical history than most people. You've got some remarkable things here in archives, and they're just opening up. You've got traditions here of military medicine, of social medicine, which have hardly been studied in Western India, and certainly in an English language. You have the opportunity to criticize the past. You have the opportunity to tell me, as an editor, something that makes me say, wow, this is new, this is unusual, and I would add this as the most important thing, the person who has written it knows why it is important. If you can't explain to me why you've written it, except that it's a chapter in my PhD, no. If you can tell me why it's important for me, somebody in Australia, somebody in Italy to read it, you're going to go far. I'm going to stop. Ask me questions. That's all I'm going to say.
Thank you very much. Вопрос?
Thank you very much for your very interesting lecture. And I have a specific historical question about the state of a physician. You have said that physician during the European history had this specific state because of their professional skills and their specific relation with other people. I mean relation between a physician and his or her patient. But I would like to ask about another social context for medicine, for example, which we could find in the writings of Pliny the Elder. who was again this type of Greek medicine, Greek physician, this specific social state for physician, and he said that we should return to the traditional medicine, and this medicine link with a certain way of organization of domus, of family. So, nowadays when we also discuss medicine, medical practices, medical way of thinking, medical ideas, we also could find that we have a physician, professional physician, and the university is a place where this process of professionalization exists, where it, we could say, set up. But also we have this medical discourse in more wider sense. We have it in families. We have these medical advices which could be given not only by a physician but some other people to whom we trust in this question. So is it, my question is it, the last thing I would like to say that I like this view you have performed here about this specific state of physician, and that we should find some, we as historians and specialized in history of medicine should find some point of dialogue with this specific professional being physician. But is it so exclusivist, and couldn't we find some other point to discuss medical ideas, medical history?
Of course. Can I come back to you on home medicine?
Mm-hmm.
There are two aspects to this which people have been looking at. One is the precise relationship between the domestic sphere of medicine, what goes on in the household at whatever period, and what takes place with the doctor. And again, there have been a fair number of studies of this, and we're now looking at enormous numbers of casebooks, doctors' casebooks, and patients' diaries. There's almost an industry in looking at what patients did or what people wrote about their health in diaries. And who knows what there is out in Omsk or somewhere like that, or let alone Moscow. The second is the relationship between professional, official, formal medicine and the medicine that comes from other ways. We often call it alternative medicine, but it can include such things as women's magazines. Where do people today find out, where do women, for the most part, find out about what's going on in medicine? I don't know. I believe there are women's magazines in Russia. I believe they are read. You find adverts. You have all sorts of information. Anti-aging cream, and so on. There's a whole set of information that one can derive from, if you like, family circumstances, which then impact on the professionalization of there's enormous amounts going on of work being done on case notes, case histories. I don't know whether there's anything like that going on here. I don't know whether there's been any studies of things like medicine in women's journals, and whether what the change has been under communism now. Simple question, but it also relates to wider questions of authority, availability. It raises historians' questions, and it raises them about something which many people are interested in, and which has an impact on actual medical practice. Because people, women in particular, read about medical conditions far more than men, and about how they relate to their children. It's a major component in human knowledge of medicine. So, I hope that's a little help to you in trying to sort of put it into a bigger context, because it's the materials there, and it's questions like this, the bigger questions, that are going to get published.
Thank you.
Thank you for your very interesting lecture. And I'd like to have your opinion on a global operation, maybe comparison. I'm interested in ways and specific of professionalization of Russian medical profession in Russian Empire. So, as far as I know, in Russian Empire, Swiss and Russian Empire, doctor profession suffered from state attack from bureaucratization. What protect British doctors against this? What helped them to save themselves as a corporation?
In what period?
What
Well-
helps them to become independent, you mean? No?
In 19th century.
Well, the answer is because we had not an authoritarian state. That's first. The British state, if you like, was far less invasive than Prussia, France, Italy, and we didn't have the overall rules until the 19th century, when they were formulated with the help of doctors. And we had no, for instance, we had very rarely town physicians, Stadtärzte. Very, very few town physicians. We had small medical groups, guilds, but we rarely had guilds with authority. The London College of Physicians tried to control medical practice, but did not. It was too small. The College of Surgeons tried to impose standards. And in the British case, most of the legal requirements on the medical profession came from the medical profession itself, not from up above. And this was why, when we had the National Health Service in 1948, there was an enormous argument, because the doctors themselves had been independent. You bought your practice from another doctor. You did receive some money from, if you were giving for poorer patients, from the state system, but you were private individuals, and in the London hospitals, the London hospitals were charities not funded by the state. And so in 1948, when we have the National Health Service, there is a huge change and a battle among the physicians as whether they could accept government control, government organisation. And that's an argument that's still continuing today. And we have literally at this very moment a doctor's strike with the Minister of Health saying, I have the authority to determine your pay, full stop. And they are, you know, we haven't had that since 1948. It's partly because the state was so weak. And we didn't have that official top-down organisation that you found in much of Europe, where the state said, you must teach this, you must learn this, you must do that. We do have state legislation on medical malpractice. That's covered by something called the General Medical Council. But that doesn't cover ethics, and it doesn't cover a whole range of things you might think would fall under doctors' behaviour. That's state regulation. The colleges, the College of Physicians, the College of Surgeons, sends out guidelines. But they are guidelines, they are not official pronouncements. And we have this massive individualism, and it is at the opposite extent from what it was certainly here in the 1980s, and I suspect you're still in a state of negotiation. But that's the reason why we have such lack of experience of what it's like to be told what to do. And the doctors, the doctors pride themselves on their independence of anything to do with the state. It's the medical, when I get the Journal of the College of Physicians, there's a nice series of letters in that protesting about how accidentally or deliberately things are happening within our health system, which are affecting their behaviour, and we're not used to it. So you're going to ask a question.
I'll try. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would ask a very simple question. You have shown that the teaching of history of medicine for medical students have been set in the UK very late.
Yeah.
My simple question is why? What are the historical roots for it? If you see the situation in Germany, for example, the German history of medicine had a long tradition, and in the 19th century, if you read every textbook, handbook, or lecture course on history of medicine, in the beginning, can you read why this discipline is necessary for medical students? There are a lot of arguments, a lot of argumentative strategies, and so on. Why don't you have this tradition in the UK? What are the historical rules for this difference?
That's a question I want to know the answer to from the Russian end of things. I think the answer goes back first that medical teaching, effective medical teaching at the end of the 18th century was carried out by private individuals.
Aye.
Hunter, they had their own individual schools. the history of medicine is taught by amateurs within medical schools, and it serves what I would call not a propedeutic function, but the aim is to give you pride in your profession and in your medical school. That's it. In a sense, it's symbolic.
So identity.
And it's your idea. Yeah, we're creating an identity. The medical schools themselves continued to be very different one from another. And you will hear horror stories about how you got into medical school. We had one only the other day about, the Times in letters about medical school qualifications. And the man said, well, I went to St Mary's Medical School, I applied to go there, and when at my interview I said that I didn't play rugby, but I was interested in swimming, I was turned down. However, I went on to Charing Cross Hospital Medical School, where the examiner asked me what I had done at the weekend, and I said I had been riding. Oh good, he said, do you ride in a steeplechase? And I said, well yes, my horse can jump. And he said, oh good, right, you're in they were very different. And there was no real agreement on much of the system. The change came, in part, officially, in 1995, I think. I may be wrong, I can't remember the date. Various medical schools had taken note of what was going on in London, and these units were deliberately set up by the Wellcome to act as catalysts. And so some other places developed little groups and also employed people. We also had contact with leading medical figures. Always matters. Professor Lichterman can tell you about Professor Christopher Booth, who'd been president of the College of Physicians, president of the Royal Society of Medicine. There were, I think, 10 successive presidents of the Royal Society of Medicine with whom I was on first name terms. And my senior colleagues were, on even closer terms. We knew a large number of people, but we were still surprised when the chairman of a committee to draw up the new medical curriculum insisted on having medical history in it, because there was pressure both from the government and from outside that the medics were being taught only medicine, and that there should be a place in the curriculum for things like sociology, ethics, let's call it medical humanities, medical history. And so the curriculum was completely changed. The whole basis of the curriculum was changed, and medical history became an integral part. But each medical school could teach it in the way it wanted. They could teach it when they wanted, they could teach it how they wanted. They were supposed to teach a small course in year 1 and a couple of larger courses, years 3, 4 or whatever. But it was left to each medical school to decide how to do it. Now this is individualism, but this is what happened and why, if you like, medical history came into the medical schools officially so much later. there were people already there, but the professionalization didn't really reach its end point until about 2000, when we could say every medical school has got somebody attached to it who has been properly trained. And the apothecary's course for existing medics provides them with teaching from people like me, from Bill Bynum, from professional teachers, and you learn far more. You know, so there are ways in which we've done it. But that explains that curious phenomenon that we never had an institute for the history of medicine until the welcome in the 1950s, late 1950s, early 1960s, and that was deliberately founded by the librarian on the model of Johns Hopkins. So that explains why we came late. But that's the British individualism at its best or worst. But it does mean that we've got, unlike here, we have a much more flexible system. And another one which again helps, in some universities, Oxford, Cambridge, Durham, St Andrews, you live in a college system, by which I mean that you don't live your life in a department. You may be in your department half the time, but for your meals, at least your lunches, you come to a college where you may sit next to a table like that, next to a physicist, a Germanist, a paleopathologist, a chemist, somebody who is not a medic. And that also encourages all sorts of cross-fertilization. And you can get interested in what the person next to you is doing. And you know, so there's a sense in which in some places integration and cooperation become much easier than if you were simply in a different building across the road, or in many cases these days, on the other end of town, where you never saw, you know. So we have a peculiar situation, but one I think that's helped.
Maybe I have one more acute question. Luckily, we have here our dear Professor Savelyeva, who was one of the leader or maybe key member of a so-called translation project, which was granted by a fund of George Soros. And during this project in 90s in Russia, lots of classical studies in humanities, in philosophy, in history, in social sciences were translated in Russian. And it was a great contribution to Russian academic culture. I mean, this translation of some classical texts with which researchers couldn't work before. Yeah. And during, as I know, during this project, no books on history of medicine were translated. And if we still have this great project now, what books, what key research in history of medicine should be should have a priority in this translation into Russian to organize in theoretical and methodological dimension Russian very young and very atomistic society of specialists in history of medicine. And if these texts exist, or maybe better take some best ideas from different texts and paraphrase them and write our own monographies as a summary of the experience of this long European historiographic tradition in history of medicine. So, is it clear, my question?
Yes, it's very clear, and it's almost impossible to answer. And I daren't answer it because somebody's going to say I got the wrong ones.
For example, there is a classical book of Tolkien.
What I'll say is this: that we have a variety of textbooks now available in a variety of languages, ranging from 2 volumes of what was welcome history of medicine, the 2-volume set there. There is a useful American 1-volume history of medicine. For short histories of medicine, there are a couple of German ones which are 250 pages, which are really quite good at getting over the sort of material that you are using in your courses. You know, and I think that's possibly a better way, and again, at 250 pages, that's better than, and cheaper than 500 pages. We are lucky in that there's been an enormous amount of material published in the last few years, of all kinds. I'm about to publish a translation of a new work, effectively an unknown work by Vesalius, which I hope will appear next summer, because it's in Latin, and people in the UK know Latin as well as people here, I suspect, know Italian. But you know, I think translation is important, but equally, there may be things from this end that are in Russian which you think we ought to know about. And I'm strongly against the notion that everything that deserves to be said has been said and will be said in English. And certainly when it comes to things to do with Eastern Europe, there is room for translations of good material into English by respectable publishers. So I think it's a two-way process, and I believe that we ought to know a lot more. I got very angry 8 or 9 years ago with somebody whose project was to look at state medicine in the 1930s and comparing Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, France, and said, why not Russia? Oh, well, we don't know what there was. That was precisely the reason for the comparison. So, but we need to know things from you.
Может быть, я добавлю, ведь Европейский университет в Петербурге же перевел целый том «Здоровье и болезнь» современный. There is a translation by European University in Pittsburgh into Russian, some text which is called Health and Disease on Medical History, some years ago.
No, that's fine.
I tried to explain the other context of my question. So, according to me, during last maybe 30 years, a lot of new facts, new material in history of medicine were explored. And at the same time, according to me, during the same period, there were not maybe some critically new approaches to do medical history. So we have this, according to me, this a kind of disbalance between main approaches to do medical history and this changes in the factographical basis of the history of medicine. So if we have some classical monographies in history of medicine, well, should we translate them only because we could find in these books, in these monographies, some important way of thinking, way of dealing with history, but we should remember that some facts which we could find there could be wrong because this.
Well, that's always the case.
No, we have no this problem in the history of philosophy.
On your question, in which I do think that much of the history of medicine that is written today is very much social history of medicine, of involving theories and methodologies that go back to the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
So that there hasn't been a shift as enormous since then as what came in the 1960s when we were, on 70s, when young scholars like me were bringing in social history. One question is how we relate to modern biomedicine, and that's really becoming quite an interesting problem. But I think there have been attempts in the last few years to try and think about medicine in different ways. And I think there are at least 2 or 3 of the German ones, short history, which have produced having different ideas, in particularly about medical science. But these are hardly known outside Germany. And how we do it, how we engage students is also another problem with these books. Roy Porter produced his big book for the benefit of mankind, and Roy is always enthusiastic and good. But that again is now 15 years old, and really begins to need updating, but we haven't to ask Roy to update it. But the situation now is a lot better than it was 20 years ago. That's all I will say. There are a variety of textbooks which one can use, and one is getting shorter summaries of provocative books on history of medicine. There's John Burnham's little book on what is the history of medicine, for instance, which is about that thick, written by a very distinguished senior American historian of medicine. What are we teaching history of medicine for? Which is the purpose of that book. So one can think, if you put me down and say, right, think of a series of things to put down over the next 4 days, I might be able to come up with a list. But I appreciate the difficulties. And as my wife says, you should have written it.
But you've written ancient medicine. Yes?
Yeah, I've written one book. I think I have at least 2 more if I survive.
Which are?
The book that my wife has been wanting for 40 years, which is a short biography of Galen, and there's 1 chapter written. And the book I think I can really make a difference to history of medicine with is a book on the 16th century, where there is nothing. There's nothing really good on the 16th century in English, and the last good book, short book on early modern medicine is now 15, 16, 20, maybe more than that years old, by Mary Lindemann. And because of the work I've done, I've got a totally different perspective, because I've worked on German, Italian, French, English, Spanish, Dutch material, not Russian. Well, yes, Russian. I did Xerox of the Russian day books, but that's the book. Those are the two books I may get round to writing once I finish Basilius. My wife is insisting that she wants the Galen book. So you never know. A couple of years you may get one, 3 or 4 years you may get two. But I've drawn up plans for both. And if my health survives, I may very well get round to writing. So I think there's more to come. And but I couldn't write a history of medicine. I haven't thought about it long enough. You've either got to be young and you don't know enough to worry, or you've got to be very old and you think all your mistakes don't matter. Temkin said to me, I've just produced my last book, which was published when he was 99. He said, I've decided I will publish my views on the Hippocratic Oath. He said, everybody will disagree, but by that time I do not care.
Все, будем закрывать.
Maybe it will be the last question today. I would like to know your opinion about such a newborn and fashionable, it's rather group of discipline or applied discipline as narrative medicine. Yes, because such programs, as a rule, postgraduate programs, are open now in the many European and American universities, and it was a case with my Italian colleague and friend who is at the same time the editor of the international journal about narratology in literary studies. Yes, that she was invited to participate in the organization of such a program at one small provincial Italian university, narrative medicine, which presupposes the training of medical personnel in the hints as how to communicate with the patient, etc. Yes, and she proposed to include the course of the history of medicine in such a program. And she faced a strong resistance from the part of colleagues. Yes, and could you provide us with some arguments to defend our position and to include the history of medicine in the number of courses of this program? Is it possible? Thank you.
Well, we're back on the Hayden White thesis on history and narrative. I'm surprised, I really am, because much of the history of medicine depends on narrative. It depends on telling a story, whether it's the doctor's story or the patient's story. It depends on people hearing or reading that story. And some of the work that's been done on narratology, and particularly the things that have been done down in Galveston, in Texas, that university's medical history department, really have shown the importance of narrative within a variety of contexts, including, let's say, the importance of getting the patient in psychiatry to tell the story. But it's not an area that I've ever bothered with. You see, one of the difficulties is that if you're brought up as an English historian, we don't know anything about theory. There were little moments at which theory, there were courses on history in theory in various universities. Most of those seem to have disappeared. And so a word like narratology, which I know of through classics, is not something that one, as a historian, you would easily come across. So forgive me, but what I can say is that narrative is absolutely crucial to anything to do with medicine, because telling the patient, listening to the patient, explaining your results in your papers, absolutely crucial. And it seems to me that this is a sort of prejudice against something that goes back to the past, rather than you seeing narrative as something we're writing about now. But I do not know. But I'm sorry, I'm not going to be any help on that.
But so we could say that a great specialist Vivien Nаттon is for us. So if you're against us, you are against Vivien Nаттon.
At least in the part of narrative, yes.
Yes.
Maybe rhetoric.
So, dear colleague, I kindly ask you to finish this part of our lectures, because after 15 minutes the lecture of Daniel Jacquard